I had been working as a rideshare driver to supplement my income for grad school, when one night, a passenger turned a routine drive into something much more seductive and far more dangerous. It was a slow night, but I managed to pick up a few fares. Around 2 a.m., I received a request for a long trip, about 45 minutes away. The fare looked substantial, so I accepted it, feeling stoked about the potential earnings. I drove to the pickup location, a trendy nightclub in the heart of downtown. An attractive young woman stumbled out of the club and into my car. As we began the journey to her destination, a residential area on the outskirts of town, she started to act strangely. She leaned forward, her breath heavy with alcohol, and began to compliment my appearance. I tried to maintain a professional demeanor, focusing on the road. She persisted, her words becoming more explicit and suggestive. The woman slurred her speech, asking personal questions about my relationship status and work schedule. As we continued driving, her behavior escalated. She started to run her hand through her hair, making exaggerated movements to draw attention to herself. I kept my eyes on the road, but in my peripheral vision, I could see her slowly unbuttoning her top. The tension in the car grew palpable as I struggled to maintain my composure. As tempting as it might have been to react or respond, I knew better. I didn't want to risk falling into some sort of trap that could lead to an accusation of unprofessional behavior, or worse, get me banned from the platform while she got a free ride. The woman's advances became more aggressive. She leaned closer, her partially exposed chest now clearly visible. I firmly but politely asked her to sit back and fasten her seatbelt, citing safety concerns. She giggled and complied momentarily, but soon resumed her provocative behavior. About 15 minutes into the ride, she suddenly reached for the steering wheel, claiming she wanted to go on an adventure. I quickly regained control of the vehicle, explaining that we needed to stick to the planned route. She pouted and slumped back in her seat, muttering under her breath. As we passed through a quiet neighborhood, she abruptly demanded that I pull over. Concerned, I asked if she felt ill. She shook her head and insisted she needed to pee. Reluctantly, I stopped at a well-lit gas station. I certainly didn't want her to pee in my car. She stumbled out of the car and disappeared inside the store for several minutes, leaving me anxiously waiting. When she returned, her makeup was noticeably touched up, and she reeked of cheap perfume she must have sprayed on in the store. She climbed back into the car, this time sitting directly behind me. As we resumed our journey, I felt her fingers brushing against the back of my neck, sending uncomfortable shivers down my spine. I cleared my throat and tried to engage her in casual conversation, hoping to diffuse the situation. She responded with increasingly explicit comments about my physical appearance, making me more and more uneasy. I turned up the radio, attempting to drown out her words, but she raised her voice to compete with the music. Halfway through the trip, she began to sob loudly, claiming her boyfriend had cheated on her. Her mood swings were becoming more erratic and unpredictable. I offered her a tissue from the center console, trying to be sympathetic while maintaining my distance. As she took the tissue, her hand lingered on mine for an uncomfortably long moment. The woman's emotional state continued to fluctuate wildly. One minute she was laughing hysterically at something on her phone. The next, she was angrily punching the back of my seat. I considered ending the ride early, but was worried about leaving her stranded in an unfamiliar area in her condition. As we neared her neighborhood, she began describing in graphic detail what she wanted to do with me. I remained silent, hoping my lack of engagement would discourage her. Instead, she reached out and attempted to touch my arm. I shifted away, reiterating the need for her to stay seated. She then started taking selfies, insisting that I should be in them. I declined firmly, explaining that I needed to focus on driving. Undeterred, she leaned forward, trying to angle her phone to capture both of us in the frame. The flash of her camera temporarily blinded me, causing the car to swerve slightly. With about 10 minutes left in the journey, She asked if we could stop at a drive-thru for food. I politely refused, reminding her that the rideshare service was for transportation only. This seemed to anger her, and she began kicking the back of my seat rhythmically, like a petulant child. The last stretch of the ride was tense. She alternated between sullen silence and bursts of flirtatious behavior. She made several attempts to give me her phone number, writing it on a scrap of paper and trying to tuck it into my shirt pocket. I consistently redirected her, keeping my responses short and professional. Finally, we arrived at her address. Relief washed over me as I pulled up to the curb. However, the woman made no move to exit the vehicle. She claimed she was too drunk to walk and needed help getting inside. Her tone was pleading, but there was an underlying note that felt off. Instead of getting out of the car, she sat there in the back seat, adjusting herself in a way that left little to the imagination. Her legs parted under the barely there miniskirt. She made no effort to hide her intentions. I had to fight every urge to keep my focus, reminding myself to stay professional. This was a test of my self-control. She asked again if I could walk her to the door. I politely declined. Instead, I offered to call a friend or family member for her instead. She became insistent, her demeanor shifting rapidly between flirtatious and desperate. As I held firm in my refusal, her act began to crumble. Her eyes looked around nervously, and she fumbled with her phone. Finally accepting that I wouldn't enter her home, she reluctantly stumbled out of the car. Being the gentleman I am, I waited and watched as she unsteadily made her way to her front door, fumbling with her keys before managing to let herself in. As soon as I saw she was safely inside, I drove away, relieved the ordeal was over. Once I was a safe distance from the house, I pulled over and reported the incident to the rideshare company. The next day, I received a call from the police. They informed me that the woman had filed a complaint, accusing me of making unwanted advances and threatening her during the ride. I was shocked by the false accusation and recounted my version of events of being harassed. The police seemed frustrated by the conflicting stories and lack of evidence. They explained that without corroboration, neither account could be verified or acted upon. If this was the result of staying professional, I was horrified to think what might have happened if I had fallen for her advances. The incident left me shaken and wary. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped a carefully planned trap, one that could have had severe consequences for my reputation and future. For the past couple of years, I've been harboring a secret that's been eating away at me. It's a chilling experience that I've barely shared with anyone, mainly because even now, it makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. I'm just grateful I made it through unscathed. I've finally gathered the courage to open up about that night. It was around October 2022, and I had been working a late-night shift at a 24-hour diner in a small university town here in Canada. We had rotating shifts, and I was clocking out at about 2:45 a.m. I was absolutely exhausted from serving hungry students and night owls. I lived about a 15 to 20-minute walk from work, which usually didn't bother me. I couldn't afford to take ride shares often, so I'd gotten used to walking home late at night, especially since I'd never had any issues before. That night, as I left work and began my walk, everything seemed normal. The streets were quiet, mostly deserted. I was just a few minutes from home when I saw him, just standing there at the corner where I would usually turn to head to my apartment. At first glance, I tried not to overreact, but something about him made me feel uneasy. He was leaning casually against a street sign, watching me approach. His appearance didn't scream danger right away. He was dressed casually, looked like he was in his early 30s, and had a stocky build. His skin had a pale complexion, and there was this overpowering scent of cigarette smoke wafting toward me, even though I was still several feet away. But something about the situation just felt off. As I got closer, he made his move. He stepped away from the street sign and walked straight toward me, cutting off my path. I could feel my pulse quicken, but I tried to remain composed. He started asking me questions: where I was going, if I lived nearby, complimenting my hair. I should have ignored him, but I didn't. I gave vague answers, thinking that would be enough to make him lose interest, but it wasn't. He was insistent, too insistent. As we talked, his expression never changed, but it wasn't friendly. It was unsettling, calculating. He started getting closer, reaching out to touch my shoulder and trying to grab my hand. My skin crawled, and I stepped back, making it clear I didn't want him near me. But he just laughed it off, dismissing my discomfort as if I was being ridiculous. He asked for my name. Feeling uneasy, I gave him a fake one. His reaction was immediate. His eyes narrowed, and his tone became harsh. He accused me of lying, insisting he knew my real name was Lucia and that I worked at the diner. The fact that he knew this information made my stomach drop. I was feeling more anxious by the second, desperately trying to think of a way to end this encounter. Then, without warning, he demanded my phone number. I refused, trying to sound firm, but he grabbed my wrist. I yanked my arm away, my heart racing as he reached for me again. He was too close, his hands hovering near me, his stance aggressive. I wanted to run, but I felt frozen in place. Finally, I managed to step away, my heart pounding. I told him I had to go, but as I started to walk away, he called out that he'd walk me home. He said he knew I lived nearby. His words sent a chill through me. My mind was racing. I felt completely stuck. I couldn't exactly run without drawing attention, and if I made a scene, nobody was around to help me at that hour. The streets were empty, the buildings dark, and my apartment was just a few minutes away, but those few minutes suddenly felt like miles. Then, a moment of clarity hit me. The police station. It wasn't far, maybe a 5-minute detour. I made a split-second decision and changed course, but he followed, keeping about 10 feet behind me the entire way. No matter how fast I walked, he stayed right there. I was practically jogging by the time I reached the main road. As I approached the police station, that sinking feeling in my chest started to lift. I had a damn simple plan: find a police officer and get help. The area around the station was well lit, and I could see security cameras on the building. I quickened my pace as I got closer. He was right behind me now, his tone changing from aggressive to confused. He kept asking where we were going. I didn't answer, focusing only on getting to the station. Then I saw them. 2 police officers standing outside the station entrance, deep in conversation. I had never felt so relieved to see the police before. Without hesitation, I called out to them from across the street, my voice shaky but loud. The police officers looked up immediately, clearly sensing something wasn't right. I quickly told them about the man following me, how he knew my name, and how he wouldn't leave me alone. As I spoke, I could feel him behind me, suddenly silent and tense. Then I heard the sound of his footsteps quickening as he turned and began to run away, trying to make his escape. The police officers reacted instantly. One of them quickly crossed the street towards me, while the other turned to chase after him, calling out for him to stop. I spent the next hour giving my statement and arranging for a safe ride home. The officers were kind and supportive, assuring me I had done the right thing by coming to the station. I didn't sleep much that night, too wired from the adrenaline and relief. But I felt safer knowing I had involved the authorities. After that night, I never walked home alone again. I always made sure I had a ride arranged, no matter what. But the wariness hasn't left me, even now. I work at a small wildlife lodge on the edge of a national park, primarily during the night shifts. My main responsibilities include managing the front desk, handling guest inquiries, and monitoring the security cameras for any wildlife entering the premises. It's usually quite peaceful, as our lodge isn't very large or well known. That evening, the lodge was nearly vacant, with just a handful of guests. I was reviewing trail maps at the desk when I noticed a woman approaching the main entrance. I stood to greet her as she came in. Her eyes were bloodshot and tired, and she mumbled that she needed a cabin for the night. It was evident she was exhausted, but I proceeded to check her in and gave her a cabin key. Our policy was to accommodate walk-ins as long as we were below 80% capacity. She headed towards the cabins, and I returned to my desk and the trail maps. Hours later, while still at the front desk, I heard a rustling sound from outside. It sounded like someone was rummaging through our compost bins, likely a bear looking for an easy meal. Cautious, I walked to where the noise came from and saw the same woman I had checked in, digging through our recycling area. I asked if everything was all right. She turned, her gaze unfocused and distant. I repeated my question, but she just stared blankly. Wanting to avoid any confrontation, I decided to leave her be and returned to my post. Time passed quietly, with no sounds of movement or activity. Around 2 a.m., to stay alert, I decided to do a perimeter walk and check the grounds. Just as I was nearing the front desk again, a loud crash echoed from the direction of the cabins. Pausing, I listened, then walked towards the cabin area, where I thought the noise originated. The silence was now unnerving. As I moved down the path, all was quiet, but at the end, I noticed Cabin 7's door slightly ajar. I listened, but heard nothing. Cautiously, I called out, announcing myself as lodge staff. No response came. I pushed the door open wider, peering inside from the threshold. The cabin appeared empty, but what seemed at the time to be signs of a struggle were evident: a broken lamp on the floor and clothes strewn about. At that moment, my panicked mind couldn't process what I was really seeing. Feeling uneasy about entering further, I retreated and pulled the door closed, making sure not to touch anything else. This was the cabin I had assigned to the woman, yet her car was still in the parking lot, and her hiking boots were outside the door. The guest book by the front desk showed she hadn't signed out. Given her erratic behavior earlier and these disturbing signs, I knew something was definitely amiss. I quickly returned to the front desk. I scanned all the security camera feeds around the lodge and parking area, but there was no sign of her. Suddenly, I startled. The shrill sound of the emergency phone broke the silence. I answered it. A man's voice quavered through, expressing concern about someone prowling around his cabin in the middle of the night. I apologized and assured him I would investigate. After hanging up, I took a deep breath, my nerves on edge. I was just stepping away from the desk when the phone rang again. This time, another guest, a woman from a different cabin, reported the same unsettling experience. Someone lurking around her cabin during the night. Worried about everyone's safety, I immediately called the park rangers. I waited by the main lodge for their arrival, staying close to the building just in case I needed to secure myself inside quickly. Thankfully, the rangers arrived promptly, but they couldn't locate the woman. Instead, they found a broken window in her cabin. It appeared she had climbed out. I couldn't fathom how she could have escaped without injury. While the rangers continued their search, they received information that the car she had arrived in was reported stolen from another camper. 2 days later, we got the shocking news. The woman's body had been found in a ravine about a mile from the lodge. The initial investigation revealed signs of a fall, but that wasn't the whole story. The toxicology report showed high levels of a potent hallucinogenic drug in her system. Suddenly, her erratic behavior made more sense. The rangers theorized she had been on a bad trip, explaining her confused state and strange actions. In her altered state, she had apparently climbed out the window and wandered into the wilderness. The woman's tragic fate left us all shaken. Grateful that no guests had come into direct contact with her that night, but also saddened by the unnecessary loss of life. This experience changed our protocols at the lodge. We now have stricter check-in procedures and regular night patrols. It's a somber reminder that even in the serenity of nature, unexpected dangers can lurk. I'd been working the graveyard shift at a small rural 24-hour diner for about 10 months. The job was mind-numbing, but it gave me a chance to study during the quiet hours, which helped with my online classes. The hours crawled by, and the work was monotonous. I'd often contemplated finding new employment, and the events of that night pushed me to my breaking point. It started as just another ordinary shift at the diner. I'd finished wiping down the tables and restocking the condiments when I noticed the headlights of a vehicle pulling into the parking lot. It was a beat-up van with tinted windows that obscured the interior. As the van parked, I observed a lone occupant exiting. A woman, appearing to be in her late 40s, stepped out and approached the entrance. She had graying hair and wore a threadbare denim jacket. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes. I greeted her with a smile and asked if she needed a menu. She didn't respond, just placed a $10 bill on the counter and headed to a booth. It was somewhat rude, but not uncommon in a late-night diner, especially when patrons are too tired for small talk. From behind the counter, I watched her sitting in the booth, but she seemed to be taking an unusually long time to order. She'd only left enough money for a simple meal, so she should have decided quickly. After several minutes, I approached to take her order, but she abruptly stood up and walked out of the diner. I figured she had just changed her mind, so I dismissed it and went back to my tasks, unaware that she hadn't actually left the parking lot. What I didn't realize at the time was that she had been casing the place, making sure no one else was around. As the night progressed, however, I couldn't shake an unsettling feeling. I can't quite put into words the unease that crept over me that night. There were no other customers coming in, and an eerie silence enveloped the place. Then, I heard a noise from the kitchen area. It sounded like a pan falling off a shelf. I was mopping the floor at the time this all happened, as there were no customers around, so I kept hold of the mop and cautiously made my way towards the kitchen. As I entered, I found a man there, rummaging through our supplies. He was stocky and unkempt, looking like he hadn't showered in days. I froze, paralyzed with fear, unsure how to react. The man turned and spotted me. We locked eyes for a moment. Then he began advancing towards me, his gaze never wavering. I backed away slowly, raising my hands in a placating gesture, but he kept coming. The stench of cheap liquor wafted from him, and I sensed he was volatile. He slurred, demanding to know where we kept the cash. In one hand, he clutched a broken bottle. Seeing him intoxicated and armed, I was terrified. I gestured towards the register, and he shoved me in that direction. As I opened the till, the man wandered around the diner, focusing on the dessert display. He stuffed several whole pies into a duffel bag before returning to the counter. I laid out all the money we had, barely over $200. The man looked at the cash, then at me, clearly dissatisfied with the amount. He insisted there must be more, but we simply didn't have it. He brandished the broken bottle, yelling incoherently. I thought he might lunge at me, but suddenly he snatched the money and bolted out the door. My heart raced as I watched through the window. He jumped into the same dilapidated van from earlier. The woman was at the wheel, and they sped off. The police arrived shortly after, responding to the silent alarm I'd triggered while the man was grabbing pies. Initially, the police seemed skeptical. Fortunately, our parking lot cameras had captured the van's license plate. A week later, I learned both suspects had been apprehended. They were transients who'd been living in the stolen van, robbing small businesses primarily for food and cash. I was fortunate to escape unharmed, given that their erratic behavior had left an employee at another diner with severe injuries. Within a month, I'd resigned and secured a day job elsewhere. In 2018, I was working as a driver for Uber Eats near my university. I needed the job to cover my tuition and living expenses. It wasn't glamorous, but it helped me make ends meet while studying. One night seemed ordinary at first. I started my work at 8 p.m. and spent the next few hours delivering meals from various restaurants. After a quick coffee break at a 24-hour gas station, I was back on the road by 11:30 p.m. Around midnight, my phone pinged with a new order from a late-night sushi place. The delivery address was for an office building in a business park about 15 minutes away. It wasn't uncommon to get orders from people working late, so I didn't think much of it at the time. I headed to the sushi place parked out front and picked up the neatly packed order. The restaurant was quiet at this hour, with just a few staff cleaning up for the night. The route led me away from the busy downtown area, past the quieter commercial district, right into a sprawling business park filled with various office buildings. The streets were nearly empty at this hour, with only the occasional car passing by. I relied on Google Maps to guide me through the unfamiliar area. When I turned into the correct driveway, I followed it to a modern 5-story office building. The address matched the one on my Uber Eats app. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only 2 cars present, a black sedan and an old pickup truck. I double-checked the address on my app to ensure there wasn't a mistake. Everything seemed correct. I parked my car near the main entrance and grabbed the insulated delivery bag. As I approached the glass doors, I noticed most of the building was dark, except for a few lights on the 3rd floor. I pressed the intercom button and waited. After a moment, a man's voice crackled through the speaker, telling me he'd be right down. A minute later, the door opened, and a man in his 40s, dressed in a rumpled dress shirt and slacks, greeted me with a tired smile. He thanked me for the delivery, explaining that he and his team were pulling an all-nighter for a big presentation. I handed him the food and swiped to complete the delivery on my app. He added a $10 tip on the app and gave me another $10 in cash. As I was about to leave, he asked if I could do him a quick favor. He requested help carrying some of the food to the 3rd floor. I hesitated, remembering Uber Eats' policy about not entering buildings. But the generous tip made me consider it. Still, the situation didn't sit right with me. The man noticed my hesitation and quickly added that their elevator was out of order, which is why he needed help. He started walking towards the stairwell, gesturing for me to follow. Against my better judgment, I followed him into the building. The lobby was dark, lit only by emergency exit signs. As we approached the stairwell, I noticed how quiet the building was. No sounds of a working team, no distant voices or footsteps. We climbed to the 2nd floor in silence. As we reached the landing, the man suddenly stopped and turned to face me. His expression had changed completely, from tired friendliness to something much colder. He then informed me, in a low and menacing tone, that we were alone in the building and that no one knew of my presence there. As he spoke, his hand moved to his pocket, and I glimpsed something metallic catching the dim light. In that moment, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. I dropped the food bag and bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding. I heard him shout and start to chase after me. I burst out of the building and sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys. As I started the engine, I saw him emerge from the building, looking around frantically. Shaking, I drove to a well-lit gas station and called the police. By the time they arrived at the office building, the man was long gone. The police found the building empty, with no signs of any late-night work team. It was clear he had set some kind of trap. What he had planned, I'll never know, and I hope I never find out. Since that night, I've never broken company policy again, no matter how good the tip might be.